reception of contradictory information, and the resulting confusion and anxiety from the difficulty to resolve those contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Cognitive Dissonance Podcast. In this episode, Kristy and I discuss depression. We approach the topic from a psychopharmacological perspective, right? What chemical processes are happening, what parts of the brain are activated. We also approach it from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, what cognitive narratives and stories that we tell about ourselves and the way we relate to the world, how those affect our mood and predict depressive states and how we can help climb out of those depressive states. And we also explore a little bit of the philosophy behind our conceptual structures and how we understand ourselves with our relation to others in the world. I hope you enjoy it. It was a really good conversation. My microphone has a little bit of issues in the beginning, but power through. It gets juicy.
All right.
So did you scan the Google Doc?
I did.
Okay, what'd you think?
Some great topics, some great questions. Let me look back for reference. Serotonin, SSRIs, and then what is depression from different perspectives. I think it's a great starting point for this topic, because psychopathology as a whole, like disorders of the brain, are very complicated and not very well understood and are incredibly pervasive. But even if like two people who are given the exact same like environmental changes, it could be siblings, are going to have different reactions, which is weird in medicine. So the different perspectives are key, because if you come at the topic of depression from a medical perspective, you're not going to have all the answers. If you come from a psychological perspective, you're not going to have all the answers. If you come from just a like lifestyle and health and wellness perspective, it's not going to get you there. All of these are missing something, and it's great.
Well, then let's just start at the beginning then. And by beginning, I oddly enough mean currently as well too. There's a article that just came out recently arguing against any chemical imbalance as a cause for depression. Right? So I guess the prevailing theory was serotonin imbalances were the key causes of depression and depressive episodes in people.
Right. And I think the main reason for that was they realized that serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which increase the amount of serotonin in the brain, treat depression pretty well for a lot of people. So it was this sort of backwards, like, well, then it must be serotonin. But that logic might not have been correct.
Well, and the more I think about it, the more I see how looking at it from that perspective leads to that conclusion.
Right.
So what is serotonin and what does it do in our system?
It's a chemical that goes in between neurons in your brain to send signals in response to environmental stimuli, and sometimes not, sometimes internal stimuli. I don't have a list at the top of my head of what it does besides sends messages. It's highly tied to your mood and sleep, and it is not just in your brain. It works throughout your entire body. But that's what it does in your brain, most likely.
You brought up motivation, so that would mean that serotonin is highly involved in the reward system, as in like people are motivated to do X, Y, and Z, and when they achieve those things, they get that serotonin dump, which activates the euphoric feeling, giving them that mental stimulus reward as well. We've talked in the past about, I'm sorry, my microphone keeps acting weird on my end. Does it sound glitchy and staticky to you?
No, not that I've noticed.
Okay. All right, let's start that over. I'll just cut that part out. When we talked about, can't remember if it was free will or something else, but the topic got brought up that extroverts that are exposed to novel situations and circumstances receive higher levels of serotonin response in their systems. Right, the same thing happens with adolescents. Being a teenager, that dopamine and serotonin system is activated more highly than in your 20s and 30s and stuff like that. So serotonin as the reward system, it would make sense that if there was a chemical imbalance in there, your feelings of reward wouldn't be as normal as someone that doesn't have a chemical imbalance.
Yeah, but I think, let's see, I'm thinking globally, like if you're not feeling a reward in that moment, like I just made a cup of coffee and it tastes good, I'm getting serotonin from that. And if I hadn't made a coffee and I didn't have that extra serotonin, I wouldn't feel depressed as a baseline. So I guess it does not make sense that it would be just the chemical imbalance or a lack of serotonin, because there's varying levels based on what you're doing. And if you're sitting at a low level, you're not feeling bad. Most likely you're just feeling neutral if you have if you're not depressed. But if you are depressed, then that lack of serotonin makes you feel bad, awful, depressed. So
in the inverse of what I've been saying too is there's an equal amount of studies that I've seen, especially from like 2005 on, that find in about 50% of their sample size, there's no correlation between serotonin imbalances and depressive states. So that lines up with what you're saying. But would it still be a factor? Like chemical imbalance doesn't cause depressive states or clinical depression, but it eases the way with which one can travel down that road.
I think so, because a lot of the research that I looked at talked about how if you take an SSRI to treat your depression, the level of serotonin in your brain increases immediately as soon as the medication is digested and is, across the blood-brain barrier, it is increasing serotonin the same day you take it. But you don't feel any differences for a couple weeks. And the reason for that is probably because your brain now has more serotonin, and for whatever reason, this is causing you to make new synapses, new connections, new neurons in general. It's changing the cellular structure of your brain, having these extra neurochemicals, which is true for every type of neurochemical. That's why it's kind of detrimental to your health to do heroin and meth, because
especially
having extra chemicals
too.
in your brain, it will change the cells that you're using.
Yeah, well, and then that's what I tell my students, especially when I was teaching the civics class. We got into the topic of um, policies for minimum age substance use, alcohol, tobacco,
Yeah.
stuff like that. And it was right as the national tobacco age got taken from 18 to 21, and I brought it up to them, like, why did they make that change? And none of them could answer it to me. And I had to explain to them it's because nicotine as a chemical that alters your neurochemistry has an effect on you. That's why you feel it. And a brain that's still developing, still going through the massive growth process, especially in the prefrontal cortex that happens during later adolescence, what it does is it destabilizes like the formation of solid neural networks. Right. So just like any other muscle, the more you do things in a particular way, it activates those specific pathways in your brain. And they're not fixed, but they're less malleable than the ones around it. Right. The buildup of myelin with increased uses helps kind of keep it all organized. And they end up, to use a bad metaphor, that they end up trying to build a house on a sandy foundation. Whereas pushing it to 21, hoping that they do actually wait until they're 21 to start using chemicals like alcohol and nicotine, it allows their brain to finish solidifying those neuronal pathways, at least to a higher degree. So it's a more solid foundation for them to build their house on.
Yeah. And that makes sense with serotonin as well. Well, I guess this would be true for every neurochemical, including serotonin, because are you familiar with the black box warning on SSRIs?
No.
That is, you probably heard of it, but it's the idea that people aged like 14, 15, 16, even up to 17, if they take an SSRI, they're at an increased risk of suicide attempts and suicide completion, as compared to a 20-something who started taking the same medication with the same level of symptoms, which your brain is less solidified. You start taking a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, there's more chemicals in your brain. You're seeing way different symptoms. And over time, actually, the evidence for the black box warning, the evidence that that's an actual effect has weakened. It's not as, it might be just related to the fact that teenagers are much more impulsive in general. And so you would see it in it. They're parsing out why you see that increase. It might not actually be because of the medication. It might just be a nature of being a teenager. But there is still evidence there that has happened. So
well, and
it's not to be discounted.
That's a nice transition into the second point you brought up in your list of perspectives on depression when we first started. And that's the cognition piece, the conceptual structures that we have, the cognitive patterns of behavior that we inhabit and inhibit. Those have an effect too. So I would venture to guess that a lot of the numbers skewage for adolescents is because they have less experiential knowledge with healthy patterns of behavior. And I don't mean that as a derogatory. I mean that the difference between a 15-year-old and a 5-year-old is a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old is 5 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a quarter of the older's lifetime, right? That's 25% of their development, most of which, as far as reasoning and executive function and organizational skills and abstract rationalization, happens during those last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. That does make sense. And it might, I'm trying to conceptualize someone who was sort of raised into these negative thought patterns versus someone who experienced them and started doing them later in life. And they have known and experienced different people with different perspectives and they've read about Buddhism at that point, and they have, been introduced to all of these different methods and, yoga, all these things that people do to fight off depression. Whereas someone who might be younger and has never experienced that would have uh, not as much life experience and might be more susceptible to depression just because of what they've been exposed to. But I'm not sure that that would actually work out numbers wise, because I'm it actually probably does. I'm fairly certain there is socioeconomic differences between rates of depression, being if you're in poverty and in foster care and all of these things that can be non-protective factors for depression, will increase your risks. And if you come from a rich family, a stable home, you experience some financial stability, then those are protective factors against depression, and you're less likely to have it.
Well, that's interesting too. There was a podcast I was listening to. I forget who it was with, but it was on Jordan Peterson's channel, and it was about, I don't know, probably about 18 months ago. And he was a social psychologist, and he studied the chronically poor in urban England. And what he found is it's tough to have these conversations sounding dispassionate rather than apathetic, but this is just purely dispassionate observation that people that are multi-generationally chronically poor, on average, meaning talking bell curves, population level, on average inhabit more patterns of behavior that perpetuate mental health issues and continuing to be chronically poor than those families that aren't. Right, and I think that's part of that piece that you're bringing up. Right, access to stuff, to goods, to services, offer us stability, and that stability can translate over to our psychological health too. But the lack thereof, we know for certain, can trigger to lower psychological health on average as well.
Definitely. I think there's not always, but 99% of the time, there's a stressor or a trigger that leads to an episode of depression that lasts for several months or several years, could be disproportionate to the actual stressor. And if you are poor, you are experiencing higher levels of stress day to day, and you're more likely to experience those big stressors like losing a car, losing a job, losing a family member. Just money struggles in general are very stressful. And without that stress component, it is way less likely to enter like a depressive episode and get diagnosed with major depressive disorder. If everything is going well, it's not impossible, but it usually doesn't happen unless something bad happens or something depressing happens. So those stressors are...
It has to be something thoroughly destabilizing enough.
Yeah, not every time. Sometimes it just happens, and it's way more likely to happen if you've already had one. So like if you're going on like your 7th depressive episode in 10 years, there could be no discernible stressor, because it gets more likely that you'll have another one based on how many you have. But that first one is probably going to have a legitimate stressor.
Now, would you, to take a quick detour here, would you say that that's because the neural networks that are activated when you're in a depressive state, if you have a depressive state again, helps build up the myelin along those neural pathways to promote stability in those? Or is it because once you've experienced that state of consciousness, it's easier to recognize when it's looming over your shoulder. Because those are two different things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why is it more likely to happen again? I think my thought would be, because the other thing with depression is it's very commonly diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. It's almost rare to have only one. I think 2/3 of all patients diagnosed with major depressive disorder are also diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and 2/3 of all patients diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder are also diagnosed with major depressive disorder, because those two things likely have the same cause and the same structures in your brain are affecting them. And I think that initial stressor, which puts you in that fight or flight mode, which is associated with anxiety disorders. You're in fight or flight, you're freaking out, you don't know what to do, your bank is just called, you have to leave your house in 3 days because your court date or whatever, you're getting evicted, you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow. You're in that fight or flight for, a couple hours, a couple days. And then that fight or flight goes away, the farther that the stressor gets away, but it sort of triggered this anxiety disorder now, and you're generally very anxious that you're going to lose your home, that you're going to lose your car, that something else is going to happen. And that is very commonly seen with depression, that same stressor leading to this chronic illness. And so, yeah, I would guess the latter that you mentioned, or maybe it was former, I don't recall, but I would guess that it's because you experienced that stressor in the past, you had this specific reaction. You're not dead, so your brain is probably going to do that again, just because it's happened before. But there's a lot of other factors that, like genetics and diet and sleep, that could be impacting that as well.
Yeah, which, not to make this an episode on poverty, but to connect that back with the effects of chronic poverty on people's psychological health. Having lower quality diets, lower quality sleep, lower quality job opportunities. You work second shift, you work third shift, etc. And we know in the educational community that what happens when a person is in an extended state of fight or flight is that does have permanent changes on their risk management system, right? And that will influence them to adopt patterns of behaviors to continue adverse reactions, right? So, for example, a student that has an unstable household, dad's in and out of prison, mom works second shift, something along those lines, right? A child that doesn't know if mom's going to be home when they get home today, or where home will be, because some of these students face eviction. How are they supposed to care about homework? Right? And then once they stop caring about homework because they have no incentive to, because there's worse things that they're experiencing, that like perpetuates that cycle of delinquency, or it at least jumpstarts that process. Because that's another stressor, that's something else that they're quote unquote failing at because they have something more important that they're trying to figure out. And that sends them into that cycle of, well, I'm just a failure anyway. I have no other option but to run the streets. I could only do X, Y, and Z. It's not even worth it. And it's that self-fulfilling negative feedback loop.
Yeah. The nice part of being young and experiencing those stressors is that you technically have a lot more resiliency at that age, because your brain is very malleable and it will be deeply affected by those stressors, but it's deeply malleable. So you're going to be able to bounce back and get back to a more normal thought pattern, and you're still developing. So
and
you can put yourself back on the right track.
That's something that I read about 6 months ago. I read an article that claimed it found evidence connecting early adverse childhood experiences with accelerated development in the brain. And the argument that they made was that at the developmental psychological level, what that early childhood trauma was doing was forcing the brain to mature faster so it could handle that trauma. But in turn, what that means is they peak out sooner too, right? The brain still maintains its malleability. The brain's always got an element of plasticity to it, even when you're older. But the subjects that they looked at that had traumatic experiences earlier, their brain finished its development earlier, and along that process became less malleable as their peers that had less traumatic childhood experiences.
I have heard of that with puberty, and there's a lot of research to suggest that being poor, or specifically food instability, is a really clear. If you've experienced a famine or a period of starvation, you're more likely to enter puberty a couple years to a couple months earlier than people who haven't experienced that food shortage, because your body is like, go, we're going to die. We're going to die before we're 20. Have children, get the genes out there.
We need to get more hands in the field.
Yeah. And if you're going to die young, in order to secure that your DNA is going to be passed on and you're going to fulfill that sort of biological clock, if you become aware of that clock at a young age, so that you're going to have kids younger, which is also true of people in poverty. They tend to have kids a lot younger than people who are more financially stable. It could be for that reason, that biological clock. It's most likely just education and access to, birth control and things at that point. But it wouldn't make sense that the brain, it wouldn't make sense that the brain is developing faster, because the whole body probably is.
Yeah. But like I said, it's probably a myriad of all those things that you mentioned. We tie in the cycle of delinquency and access to material goods and, the job opportunities, neighborhood opportunities, all of those things in, on top of, and this is what I mentioned briefly earlier, Richard Dawkins' selfish gene idea, right? Where it is like all of your biological processes are designed by survival to fulfill the function of passing those genes on. So that total cohesion there. But that doesn't, and I want to come back to this because I really enjoy talking about the cognitive aspects of this all, but that doesn't help us figure out what depression is.
I didn't hear that part.
It doesn't help us figure out what depression is. It's not a chemical imbalance. It's not necessarily a state of mind. It seems to be a combination of the two. It's a super complex, multidimensional structure of the human psyche. And it'd be really cool if we could try and tease and put together even just a 2D surface level map of like, just how do we define this thing? We can't even hope to treat it if we can't define it. Right, we've seen SSRI treatments and psychopharmacological interventions that do have positive effects on people, and we've seen cognitive behavioral changes that do have positive effects on people. Right, so which one, and how do we figure that out?
One of the things that kind of muddies up research for me is, and I assume for a lot of other people who are researching this, is that a lot of times most people who have an episode of depression, it lasts for about 6 to 8 months. That's kind of the average. And if you don't get treatment, you're more likely to have a depressive episode that can last several consecutive years. But it will most likely, no matter what you do, resolve after 6 to 8 months. And it is very rarely a chronic thing. Most people have an episode of depression that lasts 6 to 8 months for every couple of years for their entire life. That would be the most typical person diagnosed with major depressive disorder. That would be what you would expect clinically. And even if you don't get treatment, it's probably going to resolve. So it's difficult to say, it's not like cancer or something where if you don't get treatment, it will never resolve. It will fix itself, most likely, which I think is very comforting to a lot of people with depression. Like, it's going to stop. Just wait. Something will happen. You'll go back to that average, because there's always a pull back to the average. So it doesn't last forever for almost everybody. And you can't just say this ended the depression without acknowledging that it might have just ended on its own, because a lot of treatment takes 6 to 8 months anyways, getting on your SSRI and doing your, every 2-week 1-hour therapy session for 8 sessions. A lot of that kind of aligns with that timeline. So to say, yeah, it would solve itself. So that's the really tough part of determining if a treatment worked, because it's not a permanent state that you live in. It's not like a stomach issue or like a rolled ankle where you can solve it, or I guess a broken bone would solve itself as well. But, similarly, your body's going to heal and go back to normal. So I always have that in the back of my mind when I'm reading research that says this worked, and this worked, because also nothing would work.
Well, then that even complicates things a little bit further then, because what is depression? He gave us, we have a temporal window now, right? So it's not like just being in a bad mood for a couple days. It's not being more observant to the harshness of the reality that we live in, right? That's more of just like a personality disposition. But it's about a 6 to 12 month episode of what are some of the primary symptoms that you would see as depression?
There's 2 that you have to have at least one of, and they're the feeling depressed or sad. You either have to have that, or you have to have a loss of interest in activities that you liked to do before. And then there's a bunch of other symptoms that are optional. I think you have to have, if you just have one, feeling depressed or sad and no other symptoms, you'd still get diagnosed with depression. If you just have the loss of interest, you could still be diagnosed with depression. The other symptoms are memory issues, problems with sleep, problems with irritability and anger, like a increased like weepiness, like general just crying is a symptom, which I like that they separated that from feeling sad. They're like, if you cry a lot, that's a separate symptom than just feeling sad. And those, for me, the most interesting one of all of those is the memory loss or the memory disturbances and issues with memory. Because if you're actively in a depressive episode and you have to take a test, you do worse on it, depending on your depressive symptoms at the time, which is lending itself to the idea that depression is an issue, a genuine issue with your brain rather than your mood or affect or neurochemicals. And the other thing that a lot of people with depression have in common is different sized parts of their brain. So if you did an MRI and you measured everything out, you had 10 people who have never been depressed and 10 people who have been depressed and are on medication and 10 people who have been depressed and are not on medication. The depressed and not on medication will have smaller amygdala and hippocampuses, which the hippocampus does memory. The amygdala does the fear response, the anxiety response, and also memory and smell. But the group that is depressed and on medication would have slightly better sized brain amygdala and hippocampus sizes. And the people who have never been depressed would have what you would consider an average size. And that might be nothing, but because the size of the brain, like the size, like the size doesn't impact how it's functioning that much. But size might have nothing to do with it, with how well your hippocampus or how well your amygdala is working, but it probably means that it's not working as well. And it's been pruned in some way, and there's less cells that are active and that are working for you. So
yeah, I was going to say, looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, if there is a measurable difference in function along with size in the limbic system, which is basically everything that you listed off, the amygdala, etc., the more reptilian part of our brain, I find it particularly interesting that the lower and older in the brain you go, the more downstream effects it has on everything newer and higher.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because what are, like, almost every single symptom of depression that you labeled would be something that gets formulated in the cortex, frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, right? That's where our cognition primarily resists. All of the old unconscious, like being able to breathe, all of that stuff tends to sit older in the brain because it was developed first because it was necessary. And I find it fascinating that if we mess with the older parts of the brain, the newer parts of the brain change. And when you're talking something that keeps you alive and either generates or houses your consciousness, even a 1% change is going to be noticeable.
Yeah. The study that I looked at about the amygdala size and the hippocampus size noted that getting medicated, these people were on SSRIs, not all of them, but I think most of them, and their brain structures had grown, which means the SSRI is probably affecting the literal structure of your brain and how many cells there are and where those cells are at, which is cool. But that might be an answer to why SSRIs work, is they allow your brain to rebuild.
Yeah. We're going to take a break. We're out of time. I got the less than a minute tag, so we'll pick this up in about, I don't know, 5-ish. I'm going to just immediately jump right back on. But
okay, I'm going to go check the laundry.
Cool.
All right.
So, we left off with changes in physical size of the limbic system, at least correlating with SSRI use, as at least a neurochemical, I don't want to say cause because it's not the only one, but for lack of better terms, a neurochemical cause for proclivity for depressive states.
Yeah, accurate. That's just the right amount of like couching your statement where probably.
To remind all of our guests, this show is for entertainment. We don't claim to have any prescriptive powers or be the definitive word in any of this. So don't go and try something and say, well, the Cognitive Dissonance podcast said, we did say, but try at your own risk. No, I think that's a nice spot to switch over to a less concrete, but seems to be equally influential part of the proclivity for depression. I was watching and listening to a podcast a couple days ago. It's from the Theories of Everything channel by Kurt J. Mongol, and he was talking to Lillian Dindo. I hope I got her name right. But they were talking about the ACT therapy, right? So the acceptance therapy as like a cognitive behavioral therapy plus. and its effects on depression. And I thought it was particularly interesting because it focused a lot on the conceptual narratives that we have in our head that we use as drivers for our behavior, or depending on which psychology tradition you follow, are post hoc applied to rationalize our behaviors. And if we can, they found measurable effects if you change your cognitive narratives. There are downstream effects of treating depressive states.
Yeah. ACT is the type of behavior therapy that I am a current student of. So I hope to be competent, and right now I do apply ACT strategies to all of the clients that I work with and people I support. But I wouldn't go and say oh, I do ACT. So and ACT is one of those things where every time I read an article, I get it, I put the article down, I immediately don't get it. Like while you're reading it, while it's being told to you, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then the issue that I have with understanding how ACT works is I don't understand verbal behavior quite well enough, and how verbal behavior is interacting with your physical behavior. So the verbal behavior would be the things that you're telling yourself and the relations that you're making in your mind between things. An example for depression would be, I failed a test, I am a failure. And you feel really bad about yourself because of this one particular stressor of failing a test, which is stressful. That is tough for a kid. And how those two are related in your mind based on your verbal behavior and your history of verbal behavior. And those things are malleable. You can change the way that you think and the way that you make relations between things that happen and the way that you feel about yourself and what those things that happen mean for you in your future. And the whole idea is to change the way that you're thinking and relating things and becoming aware of them and putting in small changes at a time so that when something in real life happens, you no longer relate it to a negative thing, you relate it to a neutral or positive thing. And over time, you would eliminate all of the things that were previously stressors and your symptoms should alleviate. In my understanding, there's a lot more to it. But this is something that behavior analysts do, which is cool. Because for a while, behavior analysis did not touch with thought patterns at all. So now we're using our method of science of changing behavior to apply to thoughts, which is difficult and nuanced.
I like that because the interview that I watched led off with ACT arose out of the behavioral analytic tradition. And I know you adhere to the behavioral analytic tradition or have been trained in that one. How does that tie in then with the chemical effects on the brain? Do we really have the power to affect how serotonin affects us? Right? Is that a two-way street? Because given everything we talked about in the first half of this conversation, if we tie that into the quantifiable, measurable changes and positive effects that something as simple, I hate to say it's simple because it's far from it. In fact, it could be one of the most complex things that we endeavor to do. But changing the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and how we relate to the world lifts up our quality of existence. And in doing so, does that create a downstream effect of increasing the body's receptibility to serotonin? Because that's something else that I read in a lot of the studies, and I don't want to say like I poured through the entire literature. I read a handful of studies to get familiar enough to feel comfortable having this conversation. But in a lot of the few studies that I read, what was looked at the most is the neuroreceptor for serotonin rather than the neurotransmitter of serotonin itself. So it seems like there's more of an interconnection between serotonin response and depressive states.
That I think is accurate. The presence of the neurotransmitter of extra neurotransmitter would probably cause your brain to create extra receptors for those transmitters to kind of equalize. So if there is more serotonin in your brain at any given time, you might be making more receptors, which would increase how well that particular chemical is going to work in your brain, regardless of how much of it there is, because it can attach and do its thing and pass the message that it's meant to pass. And I think it's tough because I don't want to say that you can like harness the power of your chakras and do enough yoga to clear your depression. But there is something to that, like exercise increases the global amount of serotonin in your brain because it releases endorphins, which releases dopamine, and it's rewarding. And getting enough sleep can also increase how well these neurochemicals in your brain are working. Having a healthy, rounded diet can increase how well the serotonin in your brain and all the neurochemicals are working. And generally, increasing your health can make your brain, it will make your brain healthier. So it might be that when you're doing ACT therapy or any type of cognitive therapy, you are engaging in different activities, regardless of if you find them enjoyable. You sit down with your therapist, you say, I used to find running enjoyable, and now I haven't done it in 6 years. And then you set a goal, I'm going to run 1 time this week, and then next week I'm going to run 2 times, and next week I'm going to run 3 times, and work your way up. And by engaging in that exercise, you're increasing your serotonin and treating the depression from 2 ways: the cognitive side of rewarding yourself with or allowing yourself to be rewarded by engaging in this activity, and the activity itself is increasing serotonin. So it might be that if you engage in different activities and try different things and talk with people, you are manipulating your brain chemistry enough to have a clinically significant difference. But I don't think that any therapist who wants to keep their job would say you don't need medication. With my therapy, you don't need medication. That would be very unethical to do. And research says it works best with both.
Yeah, it would have to be a big might inputted in there, right? With my treatment, you might not need clinical intervention. Well, let's stick with your runner example for a minute, and hopefully we can tie it into something else that I was thinking about the past couple of days that I want to talk about before we're done. Physical activity, diet, taking care of yourself, being generally healthy increases the quality of your brain function. So someone that used to run 4 days a week because it helped level them out, it gave them that psychological stability, it gave them the exercise with which to have a healthy brain chemistry, and that healthy brain chemistry allowed them to keep routines and stabilize and be healthy psychologically as well. They graduate college and enter the workforce. They get married and have a child. They change careers. Something significantly destabilizing happens. Now, destabilizing here is dispassionate. It can be a good destabilization. Starting a family is a beautiful thing, right? But you're different. And this is what I want to get to in a little bit. But by having something throw off that routine stabilizing your physical health, your cognitive structures are going to change too. So what'll happen a lot of times, I suspect, is that person that used to love running but hasn't done it in 4 years, after the first year of taking a break because they had a child or they switched jobs or whatever, by year 2, they were like, I should really get back into it. But because their neurochemical levels weren't the same as they were when they were being active, their general mood and happiness isn't going to be the same because that correlates. And therefore, the stories they tell themselves about how they relate to the world are going to change too. I used to be a runner. I used to find joy in running. I might not be able to anymore. And for a significant portion of the population, when faced with that, we default to, if I don't try, I won't find out if I fail at it. And that's, I would suspect, a big driver that takes it from a year and a half off of a hobby that was healthy for you, both physically and psychologically, to that 6-year hiatus on it, to that 10-year hiatus on it, to that never doing it again. And the whole time, your general quality of psychological health is just declining at an almost imperceptibly low rate until you get 6 years later and you're like, man, my life's good. I don't know why I'm depressed.
Yeah. I would add that all of that is likely a factor, plus this goes back to like the verbal relations, where in the past, I run, I am healthy, I feel good, I'm a good person. So you end up in a good spot. And then I don't run, therefore I am not healthy, therefore I do not feel good, therefore I'm a bad person. Those relations that, like, that's a pretty rudimentary example, but it happens to a lot of people where they come to a wrong conclusion, or maybe their conclusion is right. They're not a good person, they are unhealthy, and they don't run. But all of those things, whether or not they're accurate, are going to impact the way that you feel, and they're not serving you.
That's something I tell my students when they get upset when I call them out for being stupid in class or whatever. Right? Are you upset with me because I said something that triggered you and it was mean, or are you upset with me because you recognize that I'm right and that it's true?
Right.
You know, but no, I think you're absolutely right there. The brain and our psychological states tend to either be one of two feedback loops. It's either a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop. It's never static. It's never stable. It's never one for one. This is why people always say that winners win, right? Winning's contagious. Not necessarily with sports, but just like you said, when you're doing well, you have a better outlook. It allows you to find the better aspect of things. You might be bolder and take a little bit more risks in a career change or progression in whatever, to start a family, which can feed into bigger and better things. But the second something bad happens, it might throw us off. And we all have those days where no matter what happens, the only thing that jumps out at us is all the negative things that happen. Right? It could be an absolutely perfect day, but you spilled your coffee in the morning, you dropped half your sandwich at lunch, right? You stubbed your toe when you got home, and the only thing you could think about at the end of the night is how horrible a day it was because those 3 small, simple, bad things happened. And then that's going to create that negative feedback loop where you're going to wake up in a bad mood the next day, and it's going to cause you to be less cautious in your behaviors, both physically and verbally, to others and to yourself, which is going to cause you to, if you think about when you spin a top, it's, as long as the spin is fast and consistent, it's stable. But the second it starts slowing down, you can see it start rocking, and those rocks further slow it down, which makes it rock even more until it just escalates into catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges is bringing that thought pattern to a neutral place, rather than a positive or negative place, which I think you can sell a lot more people on than I'm thinking of like early treatment. Someone just comes in, they're doing their very first session of ACT, and you tell them, we're going to change this thought pattern into something positive. You're probably going to get some like, yeah, right. Okay. Magic worker.
I mean,
no.
you're going to get the stereotypical depressed, cynical response.
Exactly. And I think that turning that thought pattern, those relations, and relating it to something neutral rather than I don't run, I am unhealthy, I don't feel good, neutral. That's it. Those are three things. So rather than relating it back to I'm a bad person or I'm a good person, sort of taking away any power that that particular thought path has by just, okay, we're at peace with that. That's the acceptance part of acceptance and commitment therapy. And that is the challenge, I think, of coming to terms with those things without having a full body, very emotional reaction to it, which is something we all do and we all struggle with.
Yeah, well, and one thing that triggered my curiosity about ACT therapy, going back to that Theories of Everything channel I mentioned, Kurt Jaimungal described it as a blend of Western objectivism and Eastern tradition, right? Because there is a very large amount of like Buddhist influence in that. It's like the first tenet of Buddhism is life is pain, right? The pain comes first. Finding meaning in spite of or in face of that pain is what the other tenets of Buddhism help you do, right? It's the same thing in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? That you have to bear your cross. The pain's going to be there anyway. It's the remarkable ability of human beings to find meaning in spite of that pain that makes us distinct, right? Mm-hmm. And then it blends that with the Western objective, like behavioral analytic tradition, right? That we have these ways to measure these things. It's not just tradition for the sake of tradition, right? There's the correlation there. But no, I really enjoyed stumbling across that because it got me thinking about going back to the whole what is depression thing. Mm-hmm. It made me think about the most concise definition of depression that I can give is people reflect on how they aren't the person that they want to be for a variety of different precipitating.
Bit for me.
That if I had to give a one sentence definition of depression, it's that people aren't who they want to be and they realize that. The realization of that, okay. Right? So you failed that test. Now you started the day with your conceptual narrative of who you are and how you relate to the world as someone that passes that test, makes the good grade, gets rewarded by their parents, starts that positive feedback loop. But instead you fail that test. And now that almost platonic form of who you thought you were, especially with relation to the world, is separate from who you actually are. And you realize that, and that creates that existential dilemma, that existential dread. Right? Same thing happens when a loved one dies. Right? You are ontologically different. Your very nature of being is different. This is the discovery that I had when I was reflecting after my father died, that up to that point in our lives, we have that higher authority to go to defer to. And then something happens, inevitably, and you become that higher authority. Right? There is that ontological, that literal change in your being, especially in being in the world. And that is destabilizing And oftentimes that change is severe enough in short enough of amount of time that it extends that destabilization. And then that got me thinking about you could make the argument that, at least metaphysically, all we are is the sum of our experiences and our metaphysical connections, right? How does someone describe themselves? Take me, for instance. I describe myself by connections with my career. I'm an educator. I'm a carpenter. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a brother, right? All of those details about who I am are stored in the form of memories. And that is me. All of those personal experiences have shaped how I understand myself, how I operate, and how I relate to the world and with others. And without all of that, like, there is no me. Even in, like, let's take this a little bit further. This is what's fascinating about near-death experiences, right? So someone that can't die and come back, for a moment their consciousness ceases to be them because it becomes everything. It's like Schrodinger's cat. Without any observation, without any connection, without any individual memory of experience, there are no boundaries. There's no way to describe or define you. You just are. You are everything, right? That's kind of like in the book of Exodus in the Bible, right? God describes himself as I am the I am. Because to bound him, to put boundaries, to place a name other than a placeholder, is to constrain that being to a definite object, which therefore by literal definition means it's not divine, right? So tying all that back to depression, it is, you could say that depression states are like those little micro deaths. I get fired from my job because of whatever reason, right? I could have cheated on, with the boss's wife or whatever, right? Or I could have just been underperforming at my job, or, I could have just been cut. I could have been doing everything right and still lose sometimes, right? It doesn't matter what the precipitating cause is, but I get fired from my job and I'm no longer that being that I used to be. I'm something different. Right, that's why the being fired or let off is a major cause for depressive episodes. Same thing, having a cheating spouse or going through a divorce, any of those things, you cease to be literally what you used to be.
I think that the behavior analytic perspective and ACT therapy would agree with that, because some of your experiences are why you behave in the way that you're currently behaving. And if you have a bunch of new experiences, your behavior will change and adapt to those new experiences. It's like if you switch up the drawers in your kitchen and you keep going back to what used to be the silverware drawer and now it has baking tins. You'll do that a couple times, and then eventually you'll learn to go to the correct one after making that mistake a couple of times and get back to no longer making errors. You're going to the right spot every time. And I think similarly, your thought patterns do the same thing, and it's frustrating and it makes you upset. And it's called like an extinction burst. This thing that I used to do got me what I wanted. Now, no matter how hard I do it, it's not working. It gets very frustrating. You do a lot of new things. You might cry, you might have an outburst, and then it's done. Probably not going to do that again for that same thing unless something else changes. And something like that with a job, or just with something you're telling yourself, I don't have a job therefore I don't contribute to society, therefore I'm a bad person, therefore I deserve, or death would be better. Those sort of death ideation thoughts could come from something that is not at all related to that. And the person accepts it as true and as factual and as emotional and has a strong reaction to that. And then do that enough times, you get over it, you get back to normal for most people. So, yeah, I think those big changes, those destabilizing things are impacting your thoughts and your thought patterns. But I also think that it will naturally go back to something that is functional over time.
Yeah. Just like you mentioned, to a degree, you could argue that that's all our conceptual structures are, is the constant struggle to achieve homeostasis. But that psychological homeostasis is never going to happen because our experiences are never static, right? We live a dynamic and organic life. It's like they say, a man can't walk through the same river twice because he's not the same man and it's not the same river. That is both metaphysically and literally true. Right, the water molecules that pass by are going to be different water molecules. The skin cells that you shed to get out and get back into the river means that you are fundamentally physically different, even if it's just one atom difference. It is different. But then also too, having an experience changes the way we relate to having that experience again. That's what I tell people about. As weird as it sounds, joining the army or having a child, right? They're both fundamentally the same psychological thing. You can't prepare for it at all. Doesn't matter how many videos you watch, doesn't matter how many witnesses you interview, doesn't matter how many testimonials you hear, how many how-to books you read, it doesn't matter. If you don't have the personal experience of being institutionalized through the military or immediately having every single aspect of your life permanently changed by this new living being that's in your hands, until you go through that, you have no way to accurately conceptualize how you should relate to that experience. It's just, it's too sharp of a change, right? But once you go through it, like, you go through it again and it's just, it's different because you do have an accurate way to at least conceptualize that experience. The specifics will be different, right? But you'll have that framework with which to begin to understand the thing before the thing even happens.
Right. And with your verbal behavior, whatever that thing happened, you're going to relate to yourself in some way. And having the tools to relate it to yourself in either a positive or neutral way as opposed to a negative way is going to impact how much that's going to negatively affect you in the future. Saying, yeah, it's the physical experience and then also your interpretation of the experience and how it changes you.
So how do we accurately diagnose and prescribe treatments then? Right? How do we test whether it's just your cognitive narratives that you tell about yourself, which a lot of depression is. That's what a lot of my depressive states have been. Nothing necessarily. I mean, you have those stressors, right? But the stressors don't do anything. They just stress you. It's how you interact with them that creates that hole that's difficult to climb out of, right? And everybody has gone through it to some degree and is going to go through it to some degree. How do you separate that from those that have the more neurological function root causes, whatever they may be. Because we know it's both. We've talked about both just in the last hour and a half, right? Physical changes in certain areas of your brain, on average, now we're talking bell curves and populations here, on average have measurable effects on your mood and behavior. Your mood and behavior, on average, can have measurable effects on your physical brain state. So how do we separate the two? If it's someone that has, you know, an underdeveloped amygdala, or was in Iraq and got shot and the bullet is still in their amygdala, therefore hindering normal, quote unquote, function, right? How do we separate? Like, obviously the bullet case, we would be able to just do, you know, a brain scan and see that it's there and treat that, but that's not hardly ever going to be the case.
Yeah, it's extra tough because everything if I were to diagnose someone with depression, which I do not, that is not at all in my field, I would want to know the impact on what they do day to day based on their symptoms. So, like, I didn't get out of bed 5 out of the 7 days last week. That would impact my diagnosis as to how it's affecting them. But how we actually do it is self-report. I feel a 4 out of 10 on this, and a 10 out of 10 on this, and a 1 out of 10 on this. And then they just diagnose based on self-reporting surveys, which is not that, it's not a good way to do it, because
no, but
you can say anything.
A quick question for you on that, though. All other things equal, giving people the benefit of the doubt that they can accurately self-diagnose and they are going to accurately and truthfully express their beliefs in that diagnosis, what questions are red flags for SSRI response and what questions are red flags for cognitive behavioral responses?
I think I would have a lot more reservations about medication than I would with therapy and talk therapy and ACT, because you can do ACT therapy as a perfectly healthy person and enjoy the experience. It won't be very upsetting. It's not like psychoanalysis where, you know, you sit down and you have to talk about all these terrible, horrible things. And that has the potential to, you know, re-traumatize, and that type of therapy can be pretty dangerous for a healthy person, in my opinion. So I think doing ACT and cognitive behavioral therapy would be perfectly fine for a healthy person to do. And taking an SSRI has a few more risks with, you know, weight gain and just all the risks of taking a medication, affecting your brain chemistry. There can be some bad side effects. So I think that type of therapy has very few risks and can still be beneficial. And medication, I don't know how doctors decide. I think they just wing it. But they'll never admit that. But I think they just pick, like, okay,
yeah,
you can get this dose.
Heard a couple weeks ago, you know, the whole, what do you look for in a blood test? What do you measure for to know how much SSRI to give somebody, or how much Ritalin, or how much Adderall? Like what biochemical markers do you look for? And the answer is we don't know.
They just say, if you say my medication isn't working, you can get a higher dose every appointment until you're maxed out, and then they switch you. And after a couple of trials, they'll just diagnose you with like treatment-resistant depression, and then you can get on a clinical trial for ketamine, and you can do vagus nerve stimulation and electroshock therapy and lots of other ones for treatment-resistant depression. But it is just based on what you're telling a doctor, which I don't feel comfortable with. And if I was a doctor, I would not feel comfortable with that. I would want a more concrete, I would want them to report,
you want data.
you know,
yeah.
how often
actual
did you eat? How often did you sleep? Yeah, which they'd still ask those questions, but it's what we're doing now is not quite enough.
We got about a minute left. Anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. Besides, just the idea that a depressive episode is just an episode and does not last forever. And so even if a person is feeling very depressed and listening to this podcast, just know that just give it time. It'll go away. And with also, treatment, it will go away faster.
I was going to say, just for the record, for anybody out there that is listening, like if you need help, get help. I've done it. Oh, yeah. Right. I know plenty of people that have done it. Take care of yourself. That way you can take care of others.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, we're out of time. I'll see you on the next one.
Woohoo!